You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. I'm Dan Gable, Technology Manager for the LRC. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language, Dick Feldman explores the concept of intercultural competence. What is it, and what does it have to do with language learning?
Not just the skills of being able to use that language, but it's also some underlying competence and understanding that underlies the experience of having learned a foreign language.
Dick, why is it important to require students in the College of Arts and Sciences to study a language? Is it more than just proficiency in communication?
It's a legitimate question. How many of those people end up really able to use, or whether they're able to or not, whether they do use those skills, those actual language skills to read even, or to, communicate with people? I mean, a lot of people just don't use it, and the administrators and the language people realize that, so they must have some kind of underlying reason, the college, for having a language requirement. And, there is one. It's not just the skills of being able to use that language, but it's also some underlying competence and understanding that underlies the experience of having learned a foreign language, is what we're really at, a set of attitudes and skills that underlie the exact vocabulary and grammar and, skills, fluency that you learn in a language class. It is a little bit perverse to be quizzing and assessing people on one thing and feeling that the underlying real goal of it is something else. But I'd argue that that's true in other fields, too. I mean, you get quizzed on all these details about history of this and that.
Yeah.
And the underlying goal there is, some more general stuff about the flow of events through time,
right,
and things like that,
right,
even though you get quizzed on very, very detailed stuff. So it's something that a humanities education does with larger goals underneath it. And what we call that is intercultural competence, a phrase that's just become common in the last 10 years, I think, and has taken over, that builds on a set of competences that began with the movement in the 70s called communicative competence, basically saying that you needed to be able to actually communicate with people, not just translate stuff.
Right.
And that you needed to be able to say things that were important to you. And then there are a bunch of other competences that have been discussed through the years, pragmatic competence, and so forth. But intercultural competence is now being taken pretty seriously as a goal, and it's a pretty ambitious goal for in the U.S. language class. People generally think that it consists of attitudes, skills, and knowledge. Those are kind of divided up. Some people think that it's mostly just the attitudes.
What do you mean by attitudes?
Right. Well, this would be attitudes about other cultures. One fairly well-accepted analysis of the development of these attitudes shows a set of stages that people go through. And this analysis has become proprietary and charged for and supposedly validated by lots of people, and it is accepted by many, many, many researchers in the field. But it's a little bit one way and rigid, I think. But it's interesting to see. I think it exemplifies the kinds of things we mean by attitudes. So this would be a progression from a beginning of somebody who has no experience with other cultures and never thought about it much, and that would be just kind of a denial of difference.
Yeah, I see.
Those people, they're just the same as we are.
Right.
And that's from somebody who hasn't encountered other cultures and never really thought about it too much.
Sure.
And then you can pass from that to a kind of defensive attitude about it, that those people may be different, but I'm not having anything to do with that.
Yeah.
I don't want to. They're out to get me, and I'm maybe stronger than they are, and so they shouldn't have anything to do with me.
It's a more fear-based approach there.
Maybe you recognize that from some political discourse
Right, absolutely.
around.
Absolutely.
Then there's minimization of difference. Well, yes, there are other cultures, but after all, we're all humans here on Earth, and we all need and want the same things, so I think people are pretty much all the same.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be a stage of minimization. And that's sort of the first half is sort of on the negative attitude side. And then on the positive attitude side goes through stages of more and more acceptance and of working that difference into your own thinking and your own ways of acting, from acceptance and adaptation to a real kind of integration where the person, him or herself, can actually exemplify and live through and interpret these different cultures, and has a feeling of belonging to different cultures, and being able to navigate the same as people do in them. So the question is, how do you get to that?
Right.
Especially how do you move from basically a negative to an accepting attitude about that? And it's not so obvious how that happens. And, to go back to what I said at the beginning, can we claim that just learning a language does that? What would you think you would have to do to change your attitude from a denial to an acceptance? What sort of experiences would you think you'd have to have?
Well, I would imagine at the very least some sort of interaction with the culture. And, I would think, going back to some topics we've talked about before, having conversation or having interaction with, one-on-one pairing, like a pairing of practicing dialogue with, or not even practicing dialogue, but actually trying to communicate with somebody, like what some of our teachers do with Skype, that sort of thing. You're on a call with somebody in another country. They are in their native country, and you're speaking their language. I would imagine that would have a serious impact on a student.
It'd be difficult to avoid issues of
Right.
cultural encounter there.
Yeah.
Yes, so, what happens in a language class, a lot of what we do is pair work with other people from your same culture.
Right.
Now, I might say, as someone who's been, say, married for a long time, that you can find different cultures in any individual if you get to know them well enough.
That's right. Absolutely.
But, when you're paired with somebody from your own class and asked to talk about what you're going to do over the weekend, probably you're not going to get into understanding of major cultural differences or have a real encounter that challenges your basic values that way. So a lot of what goes on in classes, in language classes, is expressing yourself, talking with people around you. That's not really providing you with that cultural encounter. Now, what you said does have that potential of having direct contact with somebody.
Right.
The epitome of that, the next stage or several stages after that, is study abroad.
I was going to ask about study abroad. It
Right.
seemed like that'd be an obvious way to connect with the culture.
Go there where it's all around you.
Absolutely,
And it's
sure.
not only the people that are different, but the machine on the subway that you use to pay for your trip, that's
Yeah.
within objects, cultural meanings are within objects like that,
Yeah,
especially
yeah.
functional objects like that. So you get a lot there.
Yeah.
But interestingly, people that have done research with this model have found that the typical study abroad student makes very little progress on attitude change.
Really? Huh. That's surprising.
Yep.
Huh.
Because that was, as we just said, that would seem to be the gold standard of encounter and opportunity to really make a change and difference.
Is it because the student isn't prepared to make the most out of the experience? Is there a way that they could? It seems like there's got to be a way for that to work for them. With the right attitude, the right
Yeah, well,
thought
certainly
process.
preparation is part of it. There was a big study done with 1,000 students, and they have this test that they give that's supposed to measure these attitudes, and they say is reliable and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
There was one factor that seemed to make a difference in the amount of a change in attitude that students experienced. It wasn't homestay. It wasn't going to class with people from the country. It was active mentoring during the time you're there.
I see.
And here's my interpretation of that. What you need to change your values is first as the word I keep using, an encounter or a threat to those values. Because we value things, but you know what? People can value other things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what this stuff is about, accepting the fact that people value things that are different from what I value.
Right.
So you have to have a kind of serious encounter with people thinking and acting in different ways based on different values. Then the question is, what do you do about that?
Right.
Well, the most common thing to do about that is to withdraw and say that they're stupid and those French are wimpy, or whatever kind of attitude you want to have about foreigners.
Sure.
And that's the most common, and I think explains the lack of change in attitude among most study abroad students. But what a mentor can do for you then is say, so you looked outside your room and you saw the Spanish people, families out, going into bars, the streets crowded with people at 8 o'clock at night. And you thought, these people are lazy drunkards. So that's what you thought. Well, what time do they get up? What is their daily pattern? Oh, I don't know. Well, maybe you could ask about that. What does that walking around basically mean to them? How does it work with their values? You have your immediate reaction, but maybe you need to understand that reaction in more depth. And that's what a mentor can do for you.
Yeah, I would imagine.
And that also gets into some of the other aspects of intercultural competence that I mentioned. The attitudes get changed as a result of encounter and investigation of that encounter as opposed to withdrawal from it. But there are also skills. When I co-taught ethnography, we were a little bit surprised to find that most students have never interviewed anybody. I know you've interviewed people.
Sure.
And there are some skills involved in interviewing somebody.
Sure are, yeah.
Maintaining the conversation, staying on track with your goals, but diverting and investigating interesting things that the person says. It's a complex business. So that's a skill, for example, is knowing how to interview somebody.
Yeah.
How are you going to keep track of the interesting things you learn? So there are a bunch of questions about interviewing, and that's an intercultural skill, is being able to address somebody from another culture for a period of time, to present yourself, and then to say, I'm interested in learning about these areas and carrying out an interview. And there are other things, the ability to understand and query written documents, too, to analyze a newspaper article.
Right.
And then there are things you just need to know. That's the knowledge area. Well, a lot of people think cultural skills means knowing things about the other culture. Those people have dinner at a different time. Their education system is structured like this, different from ours. So that's information about the culture, and things like the Franco period had a profound effect on Spanish life, and it still has some effect on Spanish life. You need to know a little bit about what that was. So that's culture-specific knowledge.
Right.
you can see that to gain your own intercultural competence, just in terms of being able to interpret what's going on around you, you have to know something about the local culture. And, how long does it take to gain adequate local culture knowledge? It probably depends.
Sure, yeah, I would imagine.
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
But there also is general cultural knowledge, and this is kind of the stuff of anthropology. What are the various ways humans have organized themselves, and how does that work? For example, what do families consist of? What are the different ways of thinking about what a family is? Who does it include? Who's important in the family? What are the different family roles? And if you know that kind of general cultural knowledge, then you'll be more prepared to interpret what you see around you when you try to investigate a particular culture. If you're looking at an organization in another culture, what are some of the issues of organizations? Leadership, resources, mission, initiation, finding new members, symbols within an organization. So those are human issues of organization, and some sophistication in those areas will help you interpret what you see around you and lead you to be more culturally competent.
Well, it sounds like knowledge sort of informs these other aspects of intercultural competence, the attitudes and skills. Knowing the culture, knowing the people, or knowing these issues allows you to build your skills or change your attitude about a particular.
Well, yes, and that's where the class comes in.
Yeah, and so is there a focus at Cornell on international or sort of cultural knowledge? Do classes really focus on that?
Yeah, to bring it back to the language class here, because as we said at the beginning, that's supposed to be the underlying goal of the language class. So
right.
How do we do that,
Yeah.
I think a language teacher doesn't have to be a native speaker. That's a big issue in language teaching, especially in my language teaching field of ESL. There's sort of non-native speaker teachers' rights movements, thinking that you don't have to be a native speaker to teach a language. But and there's some advantages in not being a native speaker. You can interpret the process better, maybe for people. But in a way, you're representing that culture in the classroom, and you have to be able to react as somebody from that culture would. I remember I asked a teacher once, a French teacher once, I said, how do you say pride comes before a fall in French? And she looked at me and said, Dick, I don't think that's a very French idea.
Right. Yeah, interesting.
An American teacher might have, somebody not thinking about from a cultural point of view, might have just gone about and translated that. You can certainly translate it.
Yeah.
But that authentic native reaction to, oh, really?
Yeah.
Not a very French idea. Well, what are French ideas different from, I'm off on on my path there.
Sure.
As a cultural learner.
Yeah.
Having, I think what you mentioned at the beginning, direct contact with the culture. You got to experience it yourself. And I think our language classes do a lot of that.
Yeah.
There's for quite a long time been the authentic materials movement in language classes. Don't show me so many dialogues written by teachers with a grammatical idea in mind, but let me encounter real conversation in the language.
Right.
So, film and other authentic sources are really important, and those are heavily used in Cornell language classes. That's, of course, where the role of one of the roles of our language center comes in helping teachers technically process and present that those authentic materials, because they need to be brought about in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And then another thing the Language Center does is host and support some of those what we call teletandem exchanges
Right.
that you mentioned at the beginning, where students have actual discussion with an untrained peer from the target culture. But there's some training that can go into that too. One of our Spanish teachers, Silvia Amigo Silvestre, took our ethnography course, and she's worked really on training her students to notice moments of cultural difference and contradiction, maybe, and to query them and to try to understand them better.
Great.
So she's tried to teach them to, as a mentor, to do some of this cultural querying.
Nice. Interesting. Well, boy, all this certainly goes against the idea of, we talked once before about being what the self-learner, the sort of challenges of learning a language on your own, or I imagine something like Rosetta Stone, or just using the web to, find various programs online to help you learn. I mean, it's sort of really this kind of leans away from that a bit. I would
Yes,
imagine.
that's a really good point. How are you going to develop cultural challenges on your own without any guidance? It's difficult and takes I think it takes experience and previous training to be able to do that, to notice things and to query them. It's pretty hard to do on your own without a mentor or a guide or, as you're saying, a teacher. Rosetta Stone, if you've ever looked at it, it's sort of the opposite of this because they use pictures to exemplify sentences that are saying. But for different cultures within large cultural areas, they use the same picture.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Interesting.
So that's sort of the opposite of the authentic
I'll say.
materials
I'll
movement.
say. Huh.
So that's a real flaw in it there.
It makes sense to me the importance of this intercultural sensitivity and cultural intercultural competence, but I could certainly imagine, despite every best intention, that a student may find themselves in a course where they may not be exposed to this sort of approach. They may sort of crave a little bit more of the cultural aspect of a language. Is there a way for a student to do that on their own? What can somebody do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in the end, we're responsible for our own education, so having a learner who knows where he or she is going and how to get there is certainly an important thing. So, if you do have a native speaker or somebody who responds as a somebody from the target culture, you can query that person some.
Mm-hmm.
Ask your teacher questions. What do people in this, or when you see something, why is that happening? Why do people do that? It may be, in some cases, the teacher may, especially native speakers, may be not that aware of their own patterns, of their own culture, and being questioned by a student. Why do people do that?
Right.
Isn't that seems to me, from an American point of view, a strange way to behave? And that might get the teacher thinking and responding as a cultural informant, which, as we saw, is part of the process of gaining intercultural competence. Of course, another thing to do is to go there yourself.
Sure.
And get yourself into a little bit of cultural trouble. That's
yeah. So what do you mean by that? Because that sounds kind of scary, frankly.
Uh-huh.
What do you mean by cultural trouble?
Well, I really mean about a clash of values.
I see.
So going to a place where you can't understand what people are doing. Going out into these, maybe into the Spanish bars where these families are, and instead of hanging out with people your own age, go to one of these families with the respectable-looking parents and their young adult-age children, maybe, and ask them, how does this work? Do you come here every night? Why do you go out and leave your home when it's cold outside and
so
come out to this bar?
Actually engaging people.
Yeah. Creating, and maybe they'll tell you that you're kind of stupid and irrelevant to be asking that question, but that'll give you more examples to recount to other people and to query as you go along. So by getting into trouble, I mean keeping your own values kind of front and center so you're aware of them, but then putting yourselves in positions where they're challenged.
Yeah, I see. I could actually speak to that on a personal note when I just was recently in South Korea, and I found the most sort of frightening but also really exhilarating and the most I was able to grow in my language study of Korean was going to a restaurant where it was just clearly not geared toward American tourists. And, no menu with, if you wanted to ask for something, either you knew how to say it in Korean or you pointed to something on the menu. And even that, even being afraid to just speak Korean outright, I found I gained a lot just from the interaction, from, where we want, where's our utensils? Well, there's a little drawer on the side of the table that any Korean going to that place would have certainly known to go just take it themselves. And so, we learned a little bit about the culture for sure. We definitely felt a bit of discomfort in the process, but I think that discomfort was actually a valuable tool for us. Yeah.
Maybe you eat some things that you wouldn't have eaten.
That's for sure.
What does this really mean, burying fermented cabbage in the backyard?
Right.
Is that a gross thing to do, or what? Or is it, is that consistent somehow with other things in the culture and history of that of that country? So,
Sure.
Yeah, encountering those sorts of things and realizing that you have a feeling of strangeness or even fear or even disgust with it, and then moving towards that instead of away from it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the intercultural move.
Right.
And anybody can do that. You can find places, with our modern access to evidence from other cultures.
Right.
So that's really the move an individual needs to make.
Yeah, I see.
And, as I say, some of the online things don't provide you with evidence or situations to do that. They may be of some benefit for a little bit of training to be able to say a few things, but they don't provide you with preparation for intercultural competence.
Yeah, I could see that. And it's actually a bit deceiving because there are materials that seem to be authentic or that deal with things like ordering food or whatever might be something you might do within the country, embedded in the culture or whatever. But you also find that it's not quite there.
You need to be able to
superficial.
Right, that move of yourself investigating and going a place that they didn't want to present to you because it'd be too complicated to explain or too nasty or something.
Right.
And going towards it yourself.
Yeah, I see.
And not be protected.
Right.
And then, of course, trying to get your teacher to do that too is part of the way forward.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu or look for Cornell LRC on Facebook and Twitter. Speaking of Language is produced by Sam Lupwitz and Dan Gable. Recorded by Sam Lupwitz. Original music by Sam Lupwitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.